He has emerged as a prominent national commentator on issues relating to democracy, capitalism, and American identity. His many op-eds have appeared in notable publications, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and Newsweek. As many of you know, he's a frequent guest on Fox and Friends, Tucker Carlson, and other programs, national programs. Mr. Ramaswamy also serves on the board of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity and the Philanthropy Roundtable. I think you can tell a lot about a person by what they do with opportunity and disappointment. A self-described rabid tennis fan, Vivek was a ball boy at 17 and was chosen due to an over-the-phone interview where his age was not revealed to introduce the players at a big tournament, including his hero, Andre Agassi. He enthusiastically editorialized and called him the greatest player of all time, for which he was fired. I suspect his boldness, passion, and risk-taking have paved the way for many opportunities in his life, and maybe his passion now for speaking up and championing America herself. And when things don't go well, we'll listen to how he ended a letter to his employees after a significant disappointment. He wrote, "Stay focused, stay scrappy. We have much to accomplish." Some pretty good advice to live by these days. Vivek's enormous success in the biotech and investment fields portends some interesting days ahead as he directs his own scrappy focus on the blessings of liberty and a nation he loves. Please welcome biotech entrepreneur, author, and new friend of the forum, Vivek Ramaswamy.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you to the forum for having me tonight. It's a privilege, and I do hope to meet all of you in person before long. But for now, we're going to do it this way tonight, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. So when I was 8 years old, in 1993, I was in second grade. And that's when I heard Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech for the first time. That was the dream where Dr. King said that he wanted to live in a nation and his 4 children to live in a nation where they would be judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And that dream stuck with me. It meant something to me because that was the dream that allowed my own father to come to this country 40 years ago and build a successful career at GE in Cincinnati, Ohio, despite his having a thick Indian accent. It was the dream that allowed my mom to come to this country as a foreign medical graduate and become a doctor who treated patients with Alzheimer's disease. It was the dream that allowed me, as their son, to go in a single generation from the kid of immigrants who came to this country with literally no money to becoming the founder of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. That dream stuck with me, meant something to me, and I began to take it for granted over the course of the last decade. I served as CEO of the company that I founded. I served as CEO for 7 years, and we developed medicines for a number of diseases. Probably the one that I'm most proud of is an approved drug today for prostate cancer. But in January of this year, I decided that I needed to turn my attention to addressing a different cancer in America. It wasn't a biological cancer. It was a cultural cancer, one that threatened to kill Dr. King's dream from over 60 years ago. And that new cancer is a new secular religion in America called woke culture. It's a secular religion whose belief system centers on the idea that your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation determine your identity, full stop. It says that America is a systemically racist country, that if you're Black, you're inherently disadvantaged, that if you're white, you're inherently privileged, and that your race and your gender determine your identity, your ideas, and your thoughts. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of the so-called Squad actually summed it up pretty well a few years ago when she said that we don't want any more Black faces that don't want to be Black voices. We don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be brown voices. I'm going to guess that I don't fit her description of what counts as a brown voice. But there's a really clever part about how this particular virus spreads, and it works like this. If you disagree with any of those claims, that actually means you're a racist and you just don't know it. If you say, "I'm not racist," today that means you are racist. If you say that all lives matter, somehow that means that you believe that Black lives don't matter. If you capitalize the W in white, or you fail to capitalize the B in black, that means you're racist too. And there is no greater damnation in modern America than to be labeled as a racist. So when given the choice between pledging allegiance to this new religion or being tarred with the scarlet R, everyday Americans are choosing to bend the knee. And that has created a new culture of fear in this country. Fear of losing your job, fear of getting a bad grade in school, fear of becoming a pariah in your own community. And I think the consequences could be existential for American democracy. A good measure of the health of any democracy, especially American democracy, is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually believe in public. And right now, we are doing abysmally on that metric. According to the Cato Institute, over 60% of Americans say they are afraid to express themselves in public because of the current political environment. That is not the country that my parents came halfway across the world to join. That is not the country that I learned to pledge allegiance to as a kid. That is not America, and that is not the country that I want to see America become. We have a new red guard in this country. That's the equivalent of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, except instead of pushing the philosophy of Marxism, today's new red guard is pushing this new philosophy of Wokism. And so in the name of diversity, we have actually sacrificed true diversity of thought. In the name of democracy, we have sacrificed our most important democratic norms of free speech and open debate. In the name of inclusion, we have created this new exclusionary culture where certain points of view are just not welcome. How do we get here? Wokism used to be about challenging the system, about standing up to the system. And agree or not, there's something about that which I always respected. You don't have to agree with me, but if you stand up to the system, at least I'll be willing to respect your courage. But today, Wokism is not about standing up to the system. Wokism has become the system. And the untold story of how we got here actually traces back to the 2008 financial crisis. Remember that? In 2008, after the financial crisis, corporations were the bad guys. And to the old left, corporate power was a bad thing. And what we needed to do was needed to take money from the wealthy corporations and redistribute it to poor people. Agree or not, that's what the old left had to say. But around the same time, there was the birth of a beginning of a new woke left. And according to the new woke left, the real problem wasn't poverty. It wasn't economic injustice. No, it was racial injustice and bigotry and misogyny and racism. And I'll say this, if you're a big bank in 2008, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, this proved to be the opportunity of a generation. Because now Wall Street could go not just from being the bad guys to being nobody, but from being the bad guys to being the good guys. And all they had to do was adopt these woke values. Because see, if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, that's a tough pill to swallow. But adopting woke values, that was pretty easy. Applaud diversity and inclusion, put some token minorities and women on boards, applaud or muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change, create an affinity group for analysts of color, do those things, and you're good to go. In fact, even look at last year, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, one of the most prestigious investment banks in the world, declared from the mountaintops of Davos, where else, that Goldman Sachs would not take a company public in the United States if it failed to meet Goldman Sachs' standards for board diversity, where of course they didn't specify what counted as diverse. And of course, Goldman Sachs would be the sole arbiter of what counted as sufficiently diverse. That is the way this new game is played. Banks were happy to dance to this new woke tune. They were happy to lend not just their money, but their legitimacy to this new woke movement. They were happy to use their market power in the marketplace of ideas to stuff these woke values down our throat, but they had one ask in return. They don't do this for free. Their one ask in return was to the new woke left, you got to work with your friends in the Democratic Party to make sure you leave our power intact. And it has worked masterfully for both sides. So in a nutshell, after 2008, a bunch of big banks got together with a bunch of woke millennials. Together, they birthed woke capitalism, and they put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. Bet many of you don't even remember what that was. That's the Wall Street edition. Turns out there's something very similar happening in your neck of the woods in Silicon Valley. The way that grand bargain works is as follows. Big tech in Silicon Valley implicitly agrees to censor any content that the woke movement finds offensive. And in return, they have an ask too. They tell the new woke left, work with your friends in the Democratic Party to leave our monopoly power intact. And again, it is working masterfully for both sides. That is how this new arranged marriage works. It is not a marriage of love. It is more like mutual prostitution. And the net result has been the birth of America's newest 21st century monster, the woke industrial complex. And today, it's not just Wall Street. It's not just Silicon Valley. It is corporate America as we know it. It is Coca-Cola issuing statements in Georgia about a new voting law that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer. It is that same company, Coca-Cola, holding employee training sessions on, this is their words, how to be less white. It's United Airlines saying that 50% of pilots in the cockpit have to be women or persons of color, even if that means throwing away the tests that they used to use to test for pilot competence. It's Major League Baseball moving this year's All-Star game out of Atlanta in protest to, of course, you guessed it, Georgia's new voting law. It's Nike donating tens of millions of dollars to BLM, a Marxist organization that professes to care about Black lives, meanwhile sourcing its shoes from slave labor on the other side of the world to sell $200 sneakers to Black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. That is how this new game works. And the left happens to love it because of their new love of woke values. But conservatives, too, are duped into submission because our inner conscience tells us that the market can do no wrong, while we fail to recognize that the free market that we idealize does not exist today, and so it works like a magic trick, poof. Both sides are duped into submission, and here we are quietly watching the rise of a new 21st century Leviathan that is far more powerful than either big business or big government alone, because each can do what the other cannot in the avatar of this new woke industrial complex in 21st century America. And I'm sorry to say, it gets even worse than that. Because in recent years, there's a new interloper on the scene. There's a new guest that showed up that turned this unholy alliance, if I may say it, into a threesome. And that's the Communist Party of China. They understand this game far more deeply than any of us. There is even a new Chinese word for wokeness. It's called baizuo. And it literally refers to woke white people in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us. And even worse, they are now using Wokism as a geopolitical tool to erode our moral standing on the global stage. And if you have any doubt about that, just look at what they're saying in nearly every diplomatic meeting. Just last year, Xi Jinping was called to meet with EU leaders, European Union official leaders, and they pressed him on China's human rights record, including the recent Uyghur human rights crisis, where they have locked up over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, who, by the way, Apple may use as slave labor to make their iPhones. I bet they don't tell you that. Xi Jinping's first response when pressed, the first thing he says, is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. Earlier this year, Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, comes over here to the Alaska summit, and in his opening statement, lectures us for 15 minutes about racial injustice in the United States, about the fact that Black Americans are being slaughtered, that's his word, slaughtered here in the United States, and that China hopes that the United States does better on human rights. That would be laughable if it weren't for such serious consequences on the global stage. How were they able to get away with it? The answer, of course, comes back to the American woke corporations. Take Disney. 2 years ago, Disney says that it cannot shoot a film in the state of Georgia if Georgia passes a new anti-abortion statute, the equivalent of a heartbeat bill. Yet just last year, Disney shoots Mulan in the Xinjiang province of China. That is literally ground zero, the epicenter of the Uyghur human rights crisis. And let me not just call it a human rights crisis, let's be more specific. We're talking about forced sterilizations, people who are locked up in the equivalent of concentration camps. They are not free to leave their region. They're being indoctrinated with communist propaganda. That's the kind of human rights crisis we're talking about for over 1 million people. And Disney shoots Mulan there without saying a peep until the very end of shooting the film, when they finally spoke up. And when they spoke up, what did they have to say? They said, "We thank the local authorities in Xinjiang and the Communist Party of China for allowing us the privilege of filming here." That's what they say. That's Disney. The NBA is even worse. The NBA regularly decries racial injustice in the United States. They prominently paint Black Lives Matter on their courts during the playoffs. Yet they do not say a peep as they continue to expand into the Chinese market. Even worse, when Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, a couple of years ago, tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," LeBron James, now a Los Angeles Laker, one of the most outspoken critics of the 45th president of the United States, one of the most outspoken supporters of Black Lives Matter, was actually among the first people to come to China's public defense, and even worse, denounced Daryl Morey for daring to stand with Hong Kong. That is how this game is played. Now, why do corporations and their crony celebrities go about playing this game for China, being turned into pawns, into puppets, into Trojan horses that undermine us from within? The answer is really simple. It comes down to money. Because China has built a great wall that prevents us from entering the Chinese market if we criticize the CCP. But they roll out the red carpet for any company that criticizes the United States. They are playing us like a Chinese mandolin, and it is working. And now that it's worked so well for China, they are now using that same tactic to deflect accountability for the origin of COVID-19. And if you have any doubt about that, just look at the naming of this virus. The Marburg virus is named after a town in Germany where it originated. The Ebola virus is named after a river where it originated. The Zika virus is named after a forest in Africa where it originated. The West Nile virus is named after its place of origin. The Japanese encephalitis virus is named after, well, Japan, the country where it originated. I could go on with the list of examples. It's not just other viruses. Even for COVID-19, you could say the UK strain. You could say the South African strain. You could say the Brazilian strain. You can say the Indian double mutant strain, and that's all okay. But if you say the Wuhan virus, you are immediately bashed as a racist and a bigot. Ask yourself why. The CCP has weaponized not just the pandemic of COVID-19, but the pandemic of wokeness to use the threat of racial injustice against the United States as a geopolitical tool to advance their own goals. That is the real Chinese virus that we need to fight. It is not a biological virus. It is a cultural virus that equates Chinese nihilism with American idealism. And when that happens, nihilism wins every time. Thank you, LeBron James. So who wins this game? Corporations win. Celebrities win. Woke activists win. The Chinese Communist Party wins. But the real losers of this game are the American people and American democracy itself. So what's the solution to all of this? Well, I'll tell you, one of my great heroes, a Californian and fellow American, Ronald Reagan, in 1980, correctly identified that big government was the greatest threat to individual liberty and prosperity in America. And he was right. He slashed government regulations. He cut taxes. He did what he needed to do to initiate a cultural and economic revival in America. And he was right at the time. But as another great Republican said 160 years ago, the dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. That's Abraham Lincoln. I'll say it again. The dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. And I believe that the dogmas of 1980 are inadequate to meet the stormy challenges of 2021. We cannot apply the slogans that we memorized in 1980 to meet the challenges of today. We need new solutions that meet the challenges where we find them today. That's going to require a new creative imagination for the future direction of the conservative movement, one that respects the power of private enterprise while recognizing that today's system of private enterprise is not the free market that we all idealize. Let's start talking about big tech censorship as an example. Conventional wisdom says that these are private companies and that they are free to decide what shows up on their site and what doesn't. And normally I would agree if they're really operating as private companies. But the thing that's happening today is something else altogether. Because what's really happening is that these so-called private companies have actually become pawns for the Democratic Party, the party in power, to be able to do indirectly through the back door what government cannot do under the Constitution directly through the front door, and that is censoring political opposition. And if you have any doubt about that, again, just look at what they're saying. Every few months, especially since the Democrats took over the House, and then the Senate, and then the White House, they summon big tech CEOs and they tell them, we want you to censor hate speech, where their definition of hate speech is, of course, the definition of hate speech. We want you to remove misinformation, where, of course, they're the arbiters of what counts as misinformation. And if you don't do that, Silicon Valley, we're going to come after you. We're going to regulate you. We're going to break you up. We're going to make it swift. We're going to make it sudden. These are exact words that we've heard from Democratic congressmen and Democratic senators. Well, guess what? They get on their private jets, fly back from Washington, D.C., back to Silicon Valley, where they go and do exactly what they were told to do, further empowered by a special form of federal immunity in the form of Section 230 liability protection in the Communications Decency Act, which gives them immunity to do just that. And my own view is that you can't have it both ways. You can't use both a government carrot and a stick to be able to use these private companies to accomplish political censorship that the government could not do directly and still say it's the action of private companies. We need Section 230 reform that tells these companies that you can't have it both ways. Either you operate as real private companies and don't get a special form of blanket federal immunity in the form of Section 230, or you operate as companies that generate that benefit from that blanket of immunity. But if you do, then you, just like the government, are bound by the same standards, namely the standards set forth in the US Constitution and the First Amendment itself. Either government threats alone or Section 230 immunity protection alone probably creates enough grounds to find state action, but the combination surely does, and there's strong case law to point in that direction. And if we can't use the courts alone, as I believe we can in the near term, Clarence Thomas recently threw the gauntlet and is waiting for someone to bring the case. I personally think President Trump could bring the paradigmatic case of our time to not the fake Supreme Court at Facebook, but the real US Supreme Court. Even if we don't do it that way, we ought to do it through amending Section 230 directly by saying that you have a choice, but you can't have it both ways. I'm going to apply that same principle in a different context, not in the case of big tech censorship, but now in the case of politically motivated firings in the workplace. We're seeing a trend in America where people today are not free to speak up and keep their job at the same time. They're making you choose between either being able to speak your mind freely or between being able to put food on the dinner table. But if you're an everyday American, you can no longer choose both. And I personally believe the right solution is to add political belief as a protected category right there next to the other protected categories of race, sex, national origin, and religion in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex or religion or national origin, then you should not be able to discriminate as a business on the basis of political belief either. Now, the libertarian side of my brain, and I used to think this way even 5 to 10 years ago, the libertarian side of my brain says that the last thing we should want to do is impose an added burden on businesses beyond those that we already, as a society, impose on private enterprise. In a libertarian utopia, the market, in theory, should work out these problems. If everyday conservatives are being fired from their jobs for no good reason, as I believe is happening across the country today, then that should, in theory, create a business opportunity for somebody else who could hire those same conservatives and actually use that as an opportunity. That's how the market works. And there's some truth to that. Here's my main issue. We can't apply that standard unevenly. You can't have it both ways. We can't say that we don't trust the market to police discrimination on the basis of race or sex or religion or national origin, but somehow we do trust the market to do the same thing when it comes to political beliefs. So my view is that if you can't fire somebody because they're Black or Muslim or gay or whatever, then you should not be able to fire them just because they're an outspoken conservative either. If you're a social media company and you can't deplatform somebody just because they're brown or Muslim or gay or whatever, then you should not be able to deplatform them just because they're an outspoken conservative. And this is not an academic issue. It is happening every day across this country. If it can happen to the 45th president of the United States, it can happen to anybody. So these are the kinds of solutions that we need that meet the challenges of 2021 rather than reciting the slogans that we memorized in 1980. We can bring those challenges in court today. We can bring cases in the Supreme Court that say that big tech ought to be bound by the First Amendment when they are acting as state actors. We can bring cases under Title VII, take them all the way to the Supreme Court and say that just like a business cannot enforce a religion down the throats of its employees or to bow down to a cross, they cannot enforce this new secular religion of wokeism either. That's every bit a Title VII violation as imposing any other employer mandated religion on one's own employees. Those legal solutions are available today, and I want to see everyday Americans bring those cases to court now. I believe the Supreme Court will side, using precedents, on the side of the individual plaintiffs who bring those causes of action. The next step is that beyond bringing legal action on the basis of case law, we need to amend the statutes themselves, amend Section 230, amend Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, add political belief as a protected category right there up next to race, sex, sexual orientation, post-Bostock, as well as religion and national origin. These are the kinds of legislative solutions that we need to see, and the new Republican Party needs to step up and meet the solutions and meet the demands of today rather than using their old toolkit. But even all of those legal solutions combined, and many more like them that I describe in my forthcoming book, all of those solutions are really together just going to be a form of symptomatic therapy. What we really need in this country is a cultural cure. What we really need is a new shared vision for American identity that runs so deep that it dilutes this wokist nonsense to irrelevance. Our schools are teaching our kids to be ashamed of our history rather than to be proud of it. Religion's on the decline. Patriotism has nearly disappeared. What does it even mean to be an American in the year 2021? I can't remember a time in my life where we more badly needed an answer to that question. And our lack of an answer to that question is the gaping black hole at the center of our nation's soul. And when you have a vacuum that runs that deep, bad things start to fill the void. That is what makes wokeness so appealing. It is the modern equivalent of opioid for the masses. We have spent a decade celebrating our diversity and our differences that we have forgotten all of the ways in which we are actually the same as one people. Yes, we are hungry for a cause. Yes, we are hungry for a sense of purpose. Yes, we are hungry for identity. But we have forgotten that more than any nation in human history, America can be that cause. America can be that purpose. America can give us that sense of identity, because more than any nation in human history, America was founded on a set of ideas. America wasn't a place. It was a vision of what that place could be. And that vision was plural in nature. But the most important part of that vision, especially in my mind, was the American dream. The dream I told you about in the very beginning. The idea that no matter who you are or who your parents were or what language they spoke or where they came from, you can achieve anything you want in this country with hard work, your own ingenuity, and your own commitment. That's the American dream. But over the last decade, something scary happened. We woke up from that dream. And when you wake up from a dream, pretty soon you forget what it was all about. And soon enough, you even forget how it felt to be in it. Now, I don't think it's too late. if the 2010s were about celebrating our diversity as a people, then the 2020s should be about reviving our sense of what still binds us together as one people, the American dream, e pluribus unum, from many one. Those are the values that won us the American Revolution. Those are the values that reunited us after the Civil War. Those are the values that still give hope to the free world. And if we can revive those common values, then nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus can defeat us. That is what true American exceptionalism is all about. And that is what we will need to harness in order to defeat this new woke industrial demon. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to taking questions.
Vivek, you are missing something right this minute, and that is several hundred people on their feet applauding you at the forum.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you guys. As you can tell, I care deeply about the topic we're discussing, and the topic we're discussing, I think, goes to the heart of what it means to be an American in the 21st century. So thank you. It's really important to me as well.
Indeed. Well, I can hear the applause in my mind, and I know what's happening to our audience, even though you can't see them. And so let's get started. So I've got a lot of questions. What would it take? What would it actually take to take your idea about 230 to enforce the laws, really the laws that we already have?
Yeah. So I think there's two routes. There's the route that's available to us and the route that I'd prefer to see. But I'm going to be a realist and first start with the route that's available to us. I think a plaintiff who has the right facts needs to take a case to federal court and say that these companies are violating the First Amendment. Now, I can't tell you how many reactions I've gotten after I've written about this and spoken about this idea in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, that this guy doesn't understand that the First Amendment actually only applies to government, not to private companies. You know, shouldn't Yale be revoking his degree or something like this? I think that we understand that. But the issue here is the extent to which we can demonstrably point to the ways in which these companies have actually been instrumentalized by the state to accomplish indirectly what the state can't accomplish directly through the front door. So there's a case called Bantam Books from the 1960s, in which there was actually a local bookstore owner who wanted to sell all the books that he was able to sell. But there's a local prosecutor who didn't love what that bookstore was selling. And he said, I want you to stop selling this particular book. The bookstore owner said no. So then the prosecutor said, okay, I'm going to find some other charge to bring against you personally unless you stop selling that book. And so the bookstore owner took that case to court and said that this guy is, someone who wanted to buy from the bookstore actually took this case to court and said that this is actually a book that I want to be able to buy and this bookstore should be able to sell it. Well, the Supreme Court actually found that even though the bookstore was a private company, what we were seeing was state censorship in the guise of a private enterprise. That is what's happening in Silicon Valley today, is that under the guise of private companies doing what government can't do directly, Democrats in Congress are like that local prosecutor in the Bantam Books case, using a threat of regulation, a threat of reprisal as a way of getting those companies to do whatever they want to do, using the stick. But it's even worse. They also use the carrot of Section 230 immunity, which says that actually if you go out and do that, don't even worry about it. You can't even be sued in state court for doing it. So I'm going to, Jane, I know you said you have a highly intellectual audience here. I'm going to just give you an analogy that's going to be food for thought for everybody, but I think it's a really important one. That'll help your liberal friends understand this particular argument instantly, I would venture to say. Suppose that instead of the Communications Decency Act, there was instead a different hypothetical statute. This is for illustrative purposes. The Childbirth Decency Act. And the Childbirth Decency Act is passed by Congress. And it says that we're not banning abortion. Don't worry. Just like we're not censoring speech. We're not banning abortion. But what we're doing is we're providing a form of immunity that says that if you barricade an abortion clinic and block access to it, if you're a private actor, you just can't be sued in state court for it. You can't be sued for trespassing. You can't be sued for tort. You can't be sued for assault or whatever it is you do to prevent people from entering an abortion clinic. It's just an immunity shield. Oh, and by the way, hey, anti-abortion activists or Congress, we're going to call you and say that if you don't barricade those clinics, we're going to come after you, find dirt on you, and turn it over to the DOJ and bring a suit against you. I am sure that every liberal in this country would instantly see the constitutional problem, where if Roe v. Wade, agree or not, said that you can't ban abortion as the federal government, then the federal government can't indirectly use private means to accomplish the same thing. Yet that's exactly what's happening with respect to political censorship today through the combination of threats as well as the Section 230 immunity. And I think that if you turn the tables, the fact that the other side could instantly see the constitutional problem reveals what the constitutional problem is today. So how to address that? I want to see President Trump bring a case that he takes all the way to the Supreme Court, not Facebook's sham corporate Supreme Court, but the real US Supreme Court on this theory. And I think he has a chance of winning. Clarence Thomas actually wrote an opinion in recent weeks that, you know, I'm flattered to say, referenced the reasoning that I laid out in the Wall Street Journal in January. I think that they want to see the case. I think he was begging for someone to bring that case. And I think there's no more iconic case from a standpoint of American history than the 45th president of the United States bringing that case as a plaintiff. Now, he may or may not do that. What I want to see, in addition, is Section 230 reform, where we amend that statute and we make it an opt-in statute. So it doesn't apply to everybody. You can opt into it as a company. If you really need that liability in order to exist, you can opt into it, but the opt-in comes with a condition. If you get federal government protection, then with that comes the attendant restrictions on your behavior, the same restrictions that the federal government is expected to abide by under our Constitution, which is that your censorship ought to abide by the standards of the First Amendment. That's not to say that all speech is protected speech. Of course it's not. But the whole point is that the standard we're applying isn't what Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey thinks on a given day. It is the standards mandated in the US Constitution and in the jurisprudence surrounding it. And that's what I think ought to be the legislative reform that we need to see. I think it's a much more promising route than the use of antitrust law, as we're seeing from some Republicans in Congress today. And I think that the combination of both the legal challenges using case law as it exists today, plus the legislative amendments that I hope we see from a more thoughtful class of Republican leadership going forward, ought to be the right class of solutions that we bring to bear on this situation.
And what about getting the Supreme Court to hear such a case, Vivek?
I think that the Supreme Court, I think this case would race to find its way to the Supreme Court, especially if someone like the 45th president of the United States were the plaintiff in actually bringing the case. Clarence Thomas didn't have to write the opinion that he did. It was somewhat, if I may say, gratuitous, actually, in the context of the case that presented itself to the court. He was clearly sending a smoke signal, begging for a plaintiff to bring the case, because it's really one of the defining issues of our time. It's one of the defining constitutional jurisprudences, jurisprudential questions of our time. And if you think about it, it to me reminds me of the kinds of constitutional debates that we used to have about a doctrine known as the Non-Delegation Doctrine a few decades ago. The Non-Delegation Doctrine, which has actually been watered down today, but initially was a doctrine in administrative law, which said that Congress could not delegate its lawmaking responsibilities to the alphabet soup of government agencies, FDA, FCC, SEC, FTC, the alphabet soup that is the administrative state as we know it. The Supreme Court and our jurisprudence around this was really acutely aware of the way in which that could lead to an expansive and cancerous state without going through the front door of Congress. Well, I think the 21st century, and this decade in particular, presents a new challenge of a new kind of non-delegation doctrine, which says that just like you can't delegate it to the alphabet soup of the FTC or the SEC or the FDA, now you can't delegate it to the new alphabet soup of AMZN or AAPL or FB or GOOG, which is effectively the new stewards of what Congress wants to do, especially liberal lawmakers, what they can't do through the front door. And I think that nobody has really in the conservative movement fully wrapped their head around this set of issues, but I expect better of our class of Republican leaders because they need to rise to the occasion, because that is the challenge that presents itself today.
I want to give you some feedback as we go in here. People are really excited and inspired about what you're saying. They're saying you're amazing, and they're already asking how they can share the video, and we haven't even gotten through the program yet. So okay. That's what's going on at the Conservative Forum tonight. Wonderful. Somebody says this is really powerful. They ask, how can military personnel and government employees fight wokeism? What recourse is there to bring the issues to the Supreme Court? And specifically, through what organization can these people operate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think actually Title VII jurisprudence provides a pretty good vehicle where we again recognize that the government cannot stuff any religion down the throats of its employees. That includes Christianity. That includes Judaism. That includes Islam. That includes Hinduism. but it also includes one of the most popular religions of our time, of Wokism. And the question is, does Wokism actually meet the Supreme Court standard for a religion? And in my opinion, if you look at the case law, it meets the test in spades and then some. There's forbidden words, there's certain rituals, there's forbidden clothing, there are certain taboos, there are certain rituals of apology, there are rituals of excommunication, which you will go through irrespective of whether or not you apologize. It is not a belief system about a narrow set of issues. It is a comprehensive belief system that begins with an original sin inherited long before you were born. The hallmarks of religion are everywhere when you look at the content of Wokism. The Supreme Court has actually held that even secular humanism counts as a religion for the purposes of Title VII jurisprudence, that if secular humanism counts, Wokism most certainly does. In fact, there's even a very funny case called Peterson, which involved a religion. It's kind of a crazy religion if you ask me, but it's a religion called creativity, whose core tenets are white supremacy, which says that if what you do is good for the white people, that is inherently a good act. And if you do something that is bad for white people, that's inherently a sinful act. It's not a religion I subscribe to, but it was a religion nonetheless. And the Supreme Court held that it was still a religion and protected for Title VII purposes. So if under Title VII, a religion professing white supremacy counts as a religion, then certainly Wokism, which is the absence, anti-white supremacy, that ought to count as a religion too. And so I think the thing that's actually going on right now, the heart of what's going on, is every employer, including the government, but also employers in the private sector, are taking this new religion, a secular religion, but a religion nonetheless, and stuffing it down the throats of their employees. And I think those employees ought to have recourse to say, no, you cannot force me to bow down to this temple, just as you can't force me to bow down to any other temple or any other cross. And I think you'll be on very good grounds to take that case to federal court now.
Well, I'm so glad you're here to participate in the heresy tonight. Another question. Somebody says that they haven't heard of any politicians talking about the political opinions or adding political opinions to the Civil Rights Act via the Supreme Court. Are you aware of any politicians that are taking this on or willing to?
I'm not, which is why I'm bringing this to the forefront of the conversation. I think that most Republican leaders lack the courage that our country and our base of conservatives deserve. We are lacking in a guiding North Star for the conservative movement. And I think that it's no coincidence that we find both the black hole of American identity and the black hole of conservative identity at the same time. Now, on the optimistic side, I'm hopeful that we can fill both of those in one fell swoop through a new conservative movement that we're going to need to start. It is personally my hope and an expectation, if I may say so, to begin to do that in a new movement that begins with the rollout of the book Woke Inc. this fall. But I don't see that class of Republican leadership rising to the occasion. I am disappointed. I'm the first person to say that I barely identify as Republican myself. I do identify as conservative. I barely identify as Republican because I don't even know what it means to be a Republican today. Now, I think that what it ought to mean to be a Republican today is that we are fighting for true liberty and prosperity of everyday Americans, recognizing that big government is only half the threat, but it is a new combination of big government, big business, and popular culture that really represents holistically the threat to everyday liberty and prosperity today. And the guiding principle should be a really simple one to the other side and to America as a whole, which is to say that you can't have it both ways. Either we get rid of protected classes altogether, which I think is a valid debate. That's a taboo debate to have, but I don't think it ought to be taboo. I think we ought to engage in that debate. But if we're not willing to engage in that debate, then we ought to apply the rules evenly, and political belief ought to be a civil right, just like the ability to be free of racial discrimination, religious discrimination, or any other form of discrimination. And to answer your question, I'm sad to say that there is nobody at the federal level that has taken this up as their cause. And I think it reflects a lack of courage in the Republican Party today. And I think that's a void that we need to fill.
I would agree. There's an enormous lack of courage. One of our members is asking about is not just a lack of courage, but the fact that the libertarians, conservatives, and Republicans have spent most of their time complaining rather than doing something about the problem. And I would add on to that you can see strategy spelled out in the writings of Marx and Alinsky. Can you speak to the poverty of strategy from those who love liberty? It seems like there's not much strategy demonstrated.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I totally agree with the lack of strategy. I think there's the lack of leadership, actually. I think that there's plenty of people who have good ideas about strategy. But at the end of the day, political movements depend on the people who are able to translate those ideas into reality. And I think that's actually been the vacuum in Republican leadership today. Look, the Republican Party, and I've had some minimal firsthand experience seeing this with a front row seat, appears to me to be a bought party historically. That the corporate interests that have effectively been pulling the strings of the Republican Party ultimately determine what the agenda is. They're in the driver's seat. And if there's some extra space in the back seat, sure, we'll cram in some other cultural reform and value for liberty and prosperity for other everyday Americans. But that's room in the back seat and in the trunk. But the driver's seat has really been the corporations and the money in power. I'm optimistic. There's one thing I'm optimistic about regarding the spread of woke capitalism. It is the burgeoning divorce between big business and the Republican Party. And I actually think that is a good thing that opens up the possibility of taking the cultural agenda in the backseat and bringing that to the front seat. By cultural agenda, I mean reviving real liberty, reviving real everyday lived experience of prosperity for everyday Americans, and putting that in the driver's seat. And so if we're going to see a transition to a better path for the Republican Party, it's actually going to be taking advantage of this gift of woke capitalism. I use that sarcastically, but I also use it seriously. This gift that may give us an opportunity to redefine the Republican Party as one that actually stands for bona fide conservative values that take on all threats to liberty rather than just the narrow threats that affect big businesses' historical agenda. And if we can go from actually being the party that accepted the merger of democracy and capitalism, the merger of money and politics, to being the party that actually today wants to see a separation of money from politics, a separation of big business from big government, a separation of capitalism from democracy so that we can preserve and leave both intact. That ought to be the calling card of the new conservative movement. And I think that there's an opportunity in this if we see good leaders rise to the occasion.
Yeah, I certainly hope so, because I think I see one right in front of me. I'm going to combine a couple questions here for you, Vivek. Somebody says, what do you see as the 2 to 3 most likely end games for the current zeitgeist? And I believe he means if this doesn't get turned around. And another question is sort of, how far does wokeness need to go? How many progressives need to get canceled before wokeness wakes itself up?
Yeah. So I have comments on both of those.
Okay.
Look, I think it is not yet too late. I think that when is it too late? I think if the class of kids who's entering first, second, and third grade now end up graduating from high school before we turn around this cultural tide, then we will have lost the war for a generation, potentially generations to come, and it may be irredeemable. I'm sure people have said throughout the course of American history that the future of the country depended on resolving the key challenges of the day, and so I'm wary of invoking that same verbiage today. But I have to say, at least in the 35 years that I've lived, I haven't seen a moment where I have been personally more concerned for preserving the identity of what it means to be an American in a way that we could lose permanently. So what does that mean? I think the next decade is a ticking time bomb for preserving our culture. And if we're able to deactivate that cultural bomb, then ultimately we may save the day. But that is the timeline that we're looking at in order to be able to turn this around, or else the consequences could be permanent. Now, to your second question, it's an interesting question about how we wage this battle. And I'm going to tell you that I am tempted, as anyone, at times, myself, even today, to weaponize the same tools used against us in return. To be able to say that if you're going to cancel us, then we're going to use the tools of silencing in return. If you're going to boycott us, we're going to boycott you back. If you're going to use market power to strong arm our thoughts in the marketplace of ideas, then the right answer is to use strength on the other side and market power in reverse to do the same thing. And maybe a little bit of that is required in the short term to just hold the line. But at the end of the day, I draw an analogy to what it takes to fight terrorism on the global stage. It's harder in the short run when you don't adopt the same methods as your enemies, as your opponents. On the global stage, we don't adopt the methods of terrorists, even though that makes it more difficult in the short run. They are willing to strike civilians, they are willing to strike children, but we are not. That makes it harder to fight in the short run, but in the long run, it is what defines who we are as a people. And I think the same goes for fighting intellectual terrorism as well. We cannot subscribe to the church of wokeness, to the church of cancel culture under a different name, or else the battle will have already been lost in a different way. I think the right answer is not just fighting wokeness in the courts and through legislation, as I've laid out and as I'm an advocate for, but the right long run answer, the lasting answer, actually has to be to dilute it to irrelevance by rebuilding an American identity that is so deep that it makes this stuff look silly by comparison. That is actually, this is sort of the tail wagging the dog. That's actually the thing that we're missing. The next generation lacks religion. They lack patriotism. Human beings, as human beings, are hungry for purpose, hungry for meaning, hungry for a cause. What we need to do is the hard work of filling that. Wokeness has filled that void, but fighting wokeness is only going to do so much. It's still going to be a black hole that's left in the end until we fill that void with something far more rich and far more meaningful, that it dilutes wokeism to irrelevance. And I think that's actually the path to winning, not just stamping it out. I don't think stamping it out at the end is really going to work, because that's going to require effectively engaging in the same errors as our opponents under a different name, and we will have lost the ultimate war under our own doing. I think the thing that we need to do is the harder work through civic education, through a civic revival in the United States, of rebuilding our sense of what it means to be not just a conservative, but what it means to be an American. And that's actually hard work, but it's the path that we need to take. And if we do, I think that that's the way we're going to ultimately win this battle, maybe not over the next year, but over the next decade. And that's, I think, the time horizon that we have to look at working on.
That's a tall request, and it's a cultural request, it's a spiritual request, and it's a request proportional to the crisis, I think. Let me tag along with that, what you just said. And one of our members asks, what do we tell our adult children and grandchildren about the woke movement? How can we help them resist the type of self-hatred and white guilt?
Yeah, look, I had a conversation with a high school senior about 6 months ago. And the conversation was about whether we should tear down the Jefferson Memorial, because Thomas Jefferson was, of course, as we all well know, a slaveholder. He was a man of sin. He was an imperfect man. He was a deeply flawed man. He was a man who didn't even abide by his own convictions in liberty because he held slaves. But he was also one of the forefathers of our country. He was one of our founding fathers. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence. And his hypocrisy was only made possible by the fact that he had ideals in the first place. And so we had this debate. I don't think I convinced him with that. But I'll tell you where I did convince him. I convinced him that rather than tearing down the statue for Thomas Jefferson, the thing we really needed to do was to build a statue for John Adams. We have a Washington Memorial. We have a Jefferson Memorial. Maybe the thing we need is an Adams Memorial. He was the second president of the United States. He was an abolitionist. He did not own slaves on principle, and he was actually one of Thomas Jefferson's greatest rivals. The two of them did terrible things to each other. The founding fathers, we tend to have this image that they were this unified group that we call the founding fathers. No, these are a divided group of people that had very different visions, competing visions, potentially played out in ugly political debates, in ugly political tactics that they used against one another. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were rivals in their day, ultimately reunified later in life, and both of them, as a side note, died on July 4th on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. If I were writing a novel and my publisher saw that, they would give me the advice that it was too sappy and that I would have to cut it. But reality is so poignant that it made that true. That's the right way forward, is reviving the stories of our history that got us here 250 years later, an imperfect history, but a rich history nonetheless, that doesn't deconstruct the parts of our history that we're ashamed of, but rather takes the full complement of history as the foundation from which we continue to build. Because America has never been perfect. America is not perfect, and America will never be perfect. And when we're talking to the next generation, we can't pretend otherwise. But I think the thing that we have to teach them is that even though America isn't perfect, even though that America will never be perfect, more than any nation in human history, America is the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. We call it the American dream for a reason. It's not a destination we reach. It is a vision that we continue to aspire to. And my hope is that when laid out in those terms, that might offer a competing and even more attractive vision for satisfying that hunger for purpose and hunger for a cause than this cheap, skin-deep Wokism of the day.
I'm absorbing what you just said because there was a lot there, including I like your expression about intellectual terrorism, Vivek. I don't want that to slide by because that's a potent expression, and your examples and illustrations are really helpful in terms of what we can tell people going forward. Is it not deeply maybe the most un-American thing we can do to make laws about who can discriminate against whom and for what reason?
Look, I'm conflicted about it. It's not the ideal state of the world that I'd love to live in. And I assume that's a question that's responsive to the suggestion to add political belief to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I think that we ought to have and reckon with an open conversation to say that the era in which we needed to use government tools to be able to set the rules of the market may have passed. And I am open, intellectually and otherwise, to having that debate. But realistically, I don't see a single Republican, I don't see a single Democrat, and I don't even see a single libertarian willing to take on that issue as their cause. Even Rand Paul has remained silent on it for the better part of the last decade. And so in a world in which we take these other dogmas as given, that somehow the restraints on being able to discriminate on the basis of race and on sex and on religion are sacrosanct. And as those interpretations of what counts as discrimination under each of those doctrines has continued to ever expand, see Bostock approximately 11 months ago from the Supreme Court, which said that sex now includes sexual orientation, even though that wasn't the original intent of the statute, based on a plain reading of the statute that had, I believe, a 6-3 majority of the court behind it, then I think that either you challenge the original dogma, but if you're not willing to do that, then we live in a completely lopsided world in which we accept unquestioningly the everyday form of political discrimination that we see in this country. And so taking a combination of idealism and pragmatism, idealism and realism, I think I am more optimistic about a path that adds political belief as a protected class than I am about a path that removes protected classes altogether. I am open to a discussion about either, but I am not open to the status quo that plays that game unevenly.
Okay. A few months ago, we had John Mates come, and one of our members would like to know, what do you think about what Amazon did to Parler?
I think it was wrong. I think it was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that violated the First Amendment. It was an abuse of Section 230. And I think that it was wrong, not just on legal grounds, it was even wrong, as best I can tell, on the facts, where even the fringe members of the movement that showed up in Washington, D.C. on January 6th actually used platforms like Facebook and Twitter far more than they used Parler to do the same thing. And if I had to guess, there was actually a new agenda that was responsive not to January 6th, but to the election, the Senate election, which ultimately decided that the balance of power was going to shift entirely in the Democratic direction, that then the companies knew exactly where their new bread was going to be buttered. And they went out and did and paid a token of homage by bending the knee and bowing their head, lying prostrate at the new temple, which was the Democratic Party's temple, which would allow them to be able to send a kind of signal that would ultimately deter the kind of regulation that might threaten their monopoly power. I have little doubt in my mind that if the Republicans had taken control of the Senate instead, we would have seen very different action when it came to social media censorship, when it came to the decision to deplatform applications like Parler, because ultimately these guys are effectively engaging in a new form of crony capitalism. They are tithing in a different currency. Back in 2008 or the pre-2008 era, crony capitalism was pretty simple. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, by the way, it's crony capitalism in both parties. Place an alumnus of your bank in the seat of U.S. Treasury Secretary, write a nice check with corporate contributions, you're good to go. That was crony capitalism 1.0. This is crony capitalism 2.0, where you tithe in a different currency. Your Goldman Sachs in January 2020, when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are the front runners for the Democratic Party, maybe they're not going to take your alumnus anymore as U.S. Treasury Secretary. Okay, that's when we issue the fiat from Davos, which says that actually we're not going to take companies public in the United States unless their boards are sufficiently diverse. This is a game they're playing. And the same thing happened in early January of this year. January 6th was the smokescreen. It was the justification. The reason was that we now had a new ruling party in power that might have been one if things broke the wrong way, that would come after corporate power, corporations engaged in self-preservation to be able to do what their new ruling overlords in Washington, D.C. actually wanted them to do. It was crony capitalism in reverse. Now, there's a problem on the right. I would be remiss in not commenting on the following issue. And look, you probably got a sense for this, Jane. I'm pretty candid. I don't really like holding back, and so I'm not going to make an exception here.
I'm not getting a back feeling from you.
I'm not capable of it. I think that a lot of the entrepreneurship on the right, including technology-based solutions, just lacks a certain level of quality. At the end of the day, you can't just have the right ideals. You got to be willing to execute at a level of quality that delivers that vision. Because as Thomas Edison once said, a vision without execution is a hallucination. And Parler wasn't a vision without execution, but it was closer to a vision without execution than it was to a vision with execution. It was a product that was shoddy. It was a product that even after it was replatformed is a lot more unattractive to join just from a technical and product perspective than other social media platforms. It was one that did not have its own infrastructural independence that was dependent on Amazon Web Services and on the Google and Apple app stores to be able to be downloaded. And so, was it unfair what happened to them? Absolutely. Do I believe it was illegal? Probably. And I think they should, and others like them should bring those cases. But at the end of the day, I also want to speak to be heard by future entrepreneurs who want to be heterodox thinkers, to build things from scratch. I've been in the position of being an entrepreneur, and it's not just about the vision. It is about having the discipline to execute on that vision. And I got to say that we on the right need to up our game a little bit when it comes to being able to compete, where, yes, the game is stacked against us and unfair. That's not an excuse to fall short of delivering high quality products. It's got to be a reason to actually double down and hold ourselves to an even higher standard, because the rest of the world certainly is.
There's a bit of a war on excellence, isn't there, as a concept?
Absolutely. So in the name of diversity, we have actually sacrificed excellence as an ideal in its own right. Look, diversity is a good thing when it's about diversity of thought, which is a means to the end of achieving excellence. But diversity should not be an end in itself. Excellence is the true end. And I think that in some ways we have sacrificed excellence at the altar. And it's not only about our sacrificing excellence, we have now actually created the reverse. We have created a new culture in which victimhood is actually the new cultural currency to get ahead. In the spirit of candor, and I'm going to share this as a first-generation American who's a son of South Asian immigrants, what I'm seeing in the Asian community now is actually a responsiveness to that new cultural trend, where excellence in academics, in activities like music and sports and other activities, was something that many immigrants inculcated in their children, because that was the way to ultimately get ahead, to be able to get a great education, to go to top universities. But now the cultural milieu that we've created is one where actually victimhood is the way to get ahead. And that's actually spreading to the Asian American community now too, to reformulate and say, okay, well, if Stuyvesant in New York City isn't going to let us in because of doing really well on standardized testing, we need to come up with new narratives about how we too are victims just like everybody else. But that's a race to the bottom from a cultural standpoint, where we have trained the next generation to prove how they're actually a greater victim than the next person, and created a new cultural competition of who accidentally wielded the most victimhood. I think that's a really dangerous course for the country. And we need to revive in lieu of, this is one of the things actually described in my book, in lieu of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The thing we need to do is not just unpack each of those agendas for the sham that each of those ideals represent, but we need to fill that void with new ideals. So you want diversity, equity, inclusion? I want excellence, opportunity, and civility. Let's build up a constructive notions of what the new vision ought to provide as a North Star for institutions, not just in government, but for companies, for museums, for nonprofits, for universities. I think that ought to be actually the way forward. Is I love the use of the word excellence. America is founded on the idea of exceptionalism, of the more, of being at the top. And we've sacrificed that idea in the name of diversity. No, diversity is subsidiary to excellence. It may be an important part of excellence, but it's in a means to the end of achieving things like excellence and opportunity and civility, which ought to be actually the real norms that allow our institutions to become the fullest versions of themselves.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about where some of this is coming from early on then with we talk about excellence. I think that part of the killing off of excellence was the everybody gets a trophy mentality, right? The good job, you showed up at school today mentality, right? So we've demonized success, and we've told everybody that they get a trophy. And it's I think it's psychologically very confusing and damaging to the nation. One of our members says, would you speak to the top of education in our country today, elementary, high school, and college? This is a huge part of the problem for young people. And I would also like you to speak as well to how this is tearing apart families, because the messages at school, and particularly in college, are literally breaking families apart.
They're literally breaking families apart. Now, I'll tell you this. Chad Sanders, the writer for the New York Times op-ed pages, wrote last year that he wanted people to tell their families and their loved ones that we will not be calling you this year. We will not be coming home for Thanksgiving and for Christmas this year unless you take significant action, financially or otherwise, towards supporting movements like Black Lives Matter. So first, this stuff began in the academy. Then it spread to infecting corporate America, which of course took it as a backroom trade to be able to find different ways of making money off wokeness. Supercharged wokeness with the potency of capitalism as it spreads to the sphere of nonprofits. But now they will stop at nothing other than actually decimating the foundation of family and our family relationships itself. And I think that the revival of education in the home actually provides the foundation for then being educated in our schools. So we're gonna have to step up and see parents step up in their role as parents. They're not just parents to be able to tuck their kids in at night. They're parents as educators. They're parents as educators at home, but they also ought to do it in a participatory way. It is not an option not to engage with your school board. Public service ought to be about real service. That involves sacrifice. It involves sacrifice of your time. It involves taking a risk by bringing your voice into a room where you may feel like you are the only one with your opinion in that room. And that is precisely the time when we actually need you to voice your opinion as well. So if we allow it, this epidemic is going to spread as far as we allow it, and it will leave nothing but destruction in its wake. But this isn't one of those epidemics that masks or the best of vaccine technology is going to be able to cure. It's going to be one that we are able to address in our everyday lives through courage and our willingness to really stand up and express our own opinion in a room. And to everyone who's hearing this on the call today, I'm willing to make a deal with you. And my deal with you is this, is that if you find yourself in one of those rooms where you believe you're the only person who believes what you do and feel a temptation to stay silent, I tell you this, I call on you to speak up at your school board meeting, at your board meeting, at your workforce diversity meeting, at home, at the dinner table. But my deal with you is that if you do that, I'll commit to you that if you speak with authenticity and with candor in expressing your true beliefs, when you're the only person in the room who has that opinion, then you will discover that you are not the only person in the room who actually has that opinion. And you will give courage to someone else who is then empowered to do the same thing. That is how we do this, not through government, not through elected office, but in our everyday lives and in our everyday institutions. That is ultimately what it's going to take to turn this cultural tide around.
Courage is, in fact, contagious, isn't it?
It is. There's something about that. Now, I think that fear spreads at a higher rate than courage, which means that it sets the bar for that much more courageous that you ultimately need to be. And speaking about the topic of excellence, the same thing goes for mediocrity. I say this, I've said this at the companies that I've run as well. This isn't a political point. This is an organizational point. mediocrity spreads far faster than excellence. And so you need to be really vigilant about managing not the spread of poor performance in an organization or a country, but about the spread of mediocrity, because that actually ossifies every institution to be not bad enough that it sets into motion the corrective mechanisms, but not good enough to ultimately advance actual opportunity and advancement, and instead has this hybrid middle ground, which ultimately anesthetizes us as a society to death. So I think the thing that we need to be mindful of is the fact that fear spreads more quickly than courage. Mediocrity spreads more quickly than excellence. But if we know that, all that means is we have to be all the more conscious about bringing courage and bringing excellence to the table in a conscious way. And if so, that's our way to winning the battle.
That's a great invitation. And I think the same is true for negativity and positivity or optimism as well.
Yeah.
Vivek, can we give you a couple more questions?
Sure. Let's take a couple more questions.
Okay, great. So do you want to add anything about critical race theory to this conversation?
Yeah, so I've been using Wokism and critical race theory pretty interchangeably. Critical race theory was the academic discipline that began in the 1990s, and it began with the intellectual foundation that actually traced back to the 1890s with Karl Marx. So Karl Marx posited that there were these invisible power relationships. In Marx's view, they were economic power relationships, invisible power relationships that governed the social universe. And that economic disempowerment was the real source of all evil. In the 1990s, critical race theory revised that narrative a little bit and said, yes, you're right about the invisible power structures, but you're not quite right about the economic root of that narrative. It's not really economic power structures. Rather, they are racial power structures. They're inherited power structures, irrespective of the amount of money you have, irrespective of your upbringing, irrespective of your material condition in society. You are inherently disadvantaged and stained with disadvantage if you're Black, and you are inherently tarnished with white privilege if you're white. So the original sin. That was what critical race theory is. It played on the Marxist trope of these invisible power structures, but it reinvented the content of those power structures from economic disempowerment to being guided by racial disempowerment instead. Now, this is a fringe academic theory, and like I said earlier, look, I don't agree with it, but if you want to challenge the system and challenge the intellectual orthodoxy of your time, I think there's something about that that at least I can respect in principle. The problem actually arose when this new philosophy merged with capitalism, and when this new critical race theory, this critical theory, this new Wokism referring to being awake to those invisible power structures, when that merged with capitalism and got supercharged with the potency of capitalism, that's when it became unstoppable. And that was the real epidemic that we saw spreading like a fire across our country, burning our institutions down. It went from challenging the system to becoming the system. And now it is the new orthodoxy without any tolerance for dissent. That's how we got to where we are. And my pitch to the next generation, to Gen Z, is that you thought you wanted to be a hippie. You thought you wanted to be heterodox by being woke. Well, guess what? Wake up to where we are today. And if you really want to be a hippie, if you really want to be heterodox, if you really want to stand up to the system, actually the way to do that today is actually become a conservative. So join us in our movement in standing up to the system, because I know you want to do it. So that's the kind of pitch I bring along. And I'm actually pretty optimistic we'll be able to bring a lot of younger people along with us.
I like that. I want to ask about your future, because a lot of people are asking about that. Before we do it, one of your gifts is being able to identify inefficiency in an effort, right? Is there an inefficiency in our effort, or a glaring or dragged out or missed opportunity that's been delayed that we can kind of bump up?
Yeah, that's a good question.
In terms of our efforts.
I'm a big fan of identifying opportunity in inefficiency. It's actually what allowed me to build a successful career in the private sector as well. I'll have to think about that as it applies to this movement, because I'm not seeing this in terms of inefficiency. I'm seeing it as a vacuum of ideals, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a good answer to that question. I guess one inefficiency has been actually at the level of who populates our school boards, right? We have spent so much attention in recent months, including as conservatives, if I may say, in worrying about elections and the laws that govern elections at the highest level. And I'm not saying that's not important, but we're doing that while also failing to have our own people step up and occupy the seats of real power in affecting the minds of the next generation, which are seats on our school boards and local institutions that actually have at least as much of an impact as the guy who sits in the White House on a given day. And I think that there's a little bit of an inefficiency in the allocation of our attention to focusing a little too much on whether or not the change in rules that we're looking to make at the state level and how elections are run, et cetera, are going to change outcomes, without actually realizing opportunities that are even in plainer sight right before us that require easier steps. It's actually not that hard to get on the school board if you try, by comparison at least. But that might actually be where we have the greatest impact on the next generation. So I want to think about that more. It's a great question. It speaks to me in my way of thinking. That's an answer off the cuff, but you've given me inspiration to begin to view the political opportunities through maybe the same lens as I might have viewed a business opportunity in a prior life.
Well, that's quite heartening because I know you've given inspiration to a lot of people listening to you tonight. So the elephant in the room, or the big question in the room, Vivek, and I've gotten it from several directions as we were speaking this evening. Do you have any political plans? Are you going to run for anything? What's next for you? They're looking for you.
I appreciate that, and I'm flattered by it. I am focused for the next 6 months or so on getting this book out. And more importantly than just the book, it's not the pages in the cover that matter. This isn't really a commercial venture for me. If there are net profits that ever come out of it, to me personally, I'm just going to put it back into this agenda anyway. But it's about really getting the message out to people. And to be able to engage with groups like you. You're among the first groups that I'm actually engaging with, even in advance of the book coming out. It's only coming out in August. But I was glad to accept your invitation, so you got to me a little bit early. But I'm going to be doing that over the course of the rest of the year. And really listening to even great questions like the ones that I've gotten on this forum today, to be able to understand where people across the country are really at, not only here at home in Ohio, but across the country, to really understand the ways in which the issues that I'm talking about here are meeting people in their everyday lives. And after I've sort of had a chance to both spread my message, but equally importantly, hear what I'm able to hear in response, I'm going to reflect on the right way to build not just an intellectual movement, but a real movement, a lasting movement, not only a conservative movement, but an American movement around this. And I'm really genuinely, honestly, open to the ways in which I might be able to do that. It might be through the political sphere. It might be through a run for office. It might not. It might actually be through driving change in our non-governmental institutions across the private sector, where there's an equally important leadership vacuum that needs to be filled as well. And so I committed to myself that I really wanted to focus on nailing it with this book and the rollout of the message in a way that catalyzed a counter movement. And then personally, what role I play in that, really there's no role too high and no role too low for me to consider playing in that counter movement myself.
Okay. Well, then would you leave us, Vivek, with one thing we can do, as one of our guest puts it, one thing we can do tomorrow.
Okay.
We heard tonight.
So this is going to sound, self-serving on its face, but I actually think it could be really powerful in helping me have the effect that I want to have in building this counter movement together with all of you. Is if you could get 5 of your friends, really, right now, the book isn't out yet, to sort of pre-order the book that I have on offer. If each of you took that as a homework assignment, I would value that, because the bigger this is on its rollout, and I've really just teased the surface here, going to a lot more depth in the book itself, that is going to be effectively what I would like to see as sort of the new 2021 Bible for what the North Star, the conservative movement's focus ought to be, and to be able to go around the country to revive a sense of energy that fills that void, getting that and reaching that in, whatever tactical things like the bestseller list, et cetera, is only going to make that job easier for me. And so because I've spent the last year and a half doing it, that's going to be one of the first things on my mind, is something that you could do that would help me tomorrow. That would be it, is get 5 of your friends or family individually to go out themselves and pre-order the book Woking. And, I think that's, as I said, this isn't something that I intend to financially from. This is something that I intend to put back in the benefits of back into the movement. Now, I think that I would be remiss if I didn't reinforce the assignment, the deal that I gave all of you earlier, which is that when you will find yourself in this position sometime in the coming months, you almost certainly will, whether it's at your place of work, your place of worship, or your dinner table at home. When you find yourself in that position where you might be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit out of your comfort zone, to be able to express yourself around people who you know won't be receptive to what you have to say, I really implore you to stand up and with civility and with respect, stand up for what you actually believe. Don't mistake civility for modulating the content of what you have to say. Don't modulate the content of what you have to say, but you can still be respectful while saying it. Those are two different things. And if you're able to do that, I am confident that you too will give inspiration to the people around you to be able to do the same thing themselves. So those would be my two asks. The first of which is really tactical and appreciated.
Thank you, Vivek. I do encourage you all to get Vivek's book and get a copy. And I like to carry things around with me because I think when other people see them, they see them consciously, they see them unconsciously, they see you reading it on a plane, if one ever gets to go on a plane again. I think that's an important way to say, this is a message that's out there. It's not a marginalized message. It's next to you. And I think that's a really good idea. So as you all witnessed tonight, this man's passion for American principles and the resulting opportunities is just tremendous. Thank you, Vivek, for being with us tonight, for sharing your work and for inspiring us with so much passion. We really,
Thanks for the invitation.
I'm just terribly excited about what's coming forward from you.
Thank you. The honor is really mine, and I hope I'll be able to come see you guys in person at some point. We'll make darn sure of it. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
We wish you the best in all your endeavors to preserve our democracy, and we're going to keep an eye on you. Know that you have now an expanded team in Silicon Valley.
Thank you. I'm flattered, and I'll keep that in mind. I appreciate it.
Good. Okay.